Hello, everybody. Welcome to the third and final installment of the Pro-Growth and Pro-Poverty IRR opinion polling series. My name is Makone Maja. I am the Strategic Engagements Manager here at the Institute, and I'm joined by the Strategic Communications Head and author of all three reports into the IRR opinion polling series, including the one that's under discussion today, Hermann Pretorius. Hermann, thank you so much for joining us. Just a brief background into these polling reports to catch you up on the first two. The first one was titled The Political State of Play as of April 2025. And that's a very important timeline because it was just around the VAT hike debacle, which explored levels of political party support during that VAT hike debate. Subsequent to that one, we had the second polling report into the policy preferences of registered voters, which discussed the appeal of present and IRR specifically policy solutions across South Africans of different, socioeconomic and racial backgrounds. And the subject of today's webinar is titled Race and Race Relations in South Africa as of 2025 rather. And it presents the findings on the perceptions of race as a socioeconomic and political factor and the overall state of race relations in South Africa. We will link all three reports in the comment section for you to go have a look. But whilst we do that, we will be listening to Hermann take us through a summary of the third. And just for some house rules on what you can expect from us today, Hermann will speak for approximately 30 to 50 minutes, and the remaining time will be used for Q&A. So make sure to put any questions that you have for him, direct them to us in the comment section, and we will try to get to as many of them as we can. I won't hold you any further. Thank you again for joining. Hermann, over to you.
Thank you very much, Makone, and thank you, the audience, for joining us this morning. The IRR's polling activities over the years has distinguished us from many other organizations, and it is one amongst many distinguishing factors, not just the legacy that goes back to 1929, not just the recognition that our work has gotten both during the apartheid era and in the post-1994 era, with international recognition and usage of some key concepts. But the opinion polling of the IRR really has a rich legacy and is central to our understanding of the country. And this third report in a series of 3 for 2025 really gets to the issue, as Makone said, of race relations. And I will take you through some key findings, the methodology we employed in our polling survey, and then, of course, I will go into some detail on the key findings. So at the top of our list of activities and boxes to tick today are, of course, the key findings. The first finding that is significant is that race relations since 1994 present a mixed but ultimately hopeful picture. While 46% of respondents believe race relations have improved, 36% believe they have worsened, and 18% say they have stayed the same. But to ensure polling accuracy and a proper understanding of the population of South Africa, we don't just ask one question and leave it at that. We try to layer questions as much as possible to make sure that we can actually extract sensible insights. So alongside that issue of race relations since 1994, We also ask the question whether people agree or disagree with the statement that the different races of South Africa need each other for progress. And there, a very strong majority of 84% of all respondents, including 80% of Black respondents, agree with that statement. So despite the perception of race relations not improving since 1994, not having a clear majority, the overall picture is balanced out by a few other questions, and that leads us to the conclusion, the finding, that race relations since 1994 present a mixed but ultimately hopeful picture. The next key finding is that while racism is experienced on the ground, its political use is widely rejected. Now, this is important because it is quite easy to be mistaken in our claim when we say that South Africa's racial divisions are not as significant as people are often led to believe. That could easily be read as a dismissal of the experience of racism in South Africa, which it is not. Pardon me. It is a factor of lived experience in South Africa that close to half of South Africans report having experienced personal racism within the last 5 years. However, again, we don't just ask a single question, we try to understand beyond just the attitude of a single data point. So in complement to that question, we also find that over 3/4, 76% of South Africans agree with the statement that talk of racism and colonialism is used by politicians to excuse their failures. So we see here that racism is experienced, that it is a reality, but that there is a rejection or a suspicion in its political use, and that is a notable finding. Then this one might be a controversial finding, but it is certainly where the data points. We find a clear link between higher experiences of racism and racialized policies like BEE and employment equity. And I will get into how we've arrived at this finding in the presentation proper, but suffice it to say, the key finding is that those segments of the South African population by race, employment status, and income most likely to be subjected to racialized policies like BEE or employment equity targets, report higher than average personal experiences of racism. Despite the broad societal goodwill, the shadow of race-based policies looms ever larger in the experience of racism in South Africa, and we will get to the details of that finding. Then, national priorities, continuing a multi-year trend, are firmly de-racialized in the sense that priorities overlap between race groups with some variation in the specificity of rankings. But in the main, the issues of jobs, corruption, and crime rank highly for all population groups. Adding to the understanding of the perception and experience of race and race relations in South Africa, it is significant that the issue of racism is considered to be a top national priority by only 2% of the South African population, and that BEE is considered a top priority by only 4% of the population. Moving on to the next key finding, on racial inequality, the consensus is that progress will come through opportunity, not racial engineering. A strong majority of 73% agree that, quote, with better education and more jobs, the present inequality between the races will steadily disappear. This belief, once again, is shared across all race groups, with 71% of Blacks, 78% of Coloreds, 80% of Indians, and 83% of whites finding common ground. Then onto the issue of merit and fairness. Competition through merit rather than racial quotas is preferred and considered fair. Now, this we deduct from various questions, once again, not just relying on one question. We ask the question as relates to national sports teams being picked, and we ask in terms of procurement policies, whether people care strongly about the BEE pillar of procurement being used as a transformation tool. And then, of course, we ask on appointments in general. And on all three of these metrics, we find that South Africans prefer merit and value for money on the one side, as opposed to racialized quotas or targets on the other. Pardon me. Finally, our key finding number 7 is that even within the ANC's own support base, voters diverge from the party's aggressive race-based policies. Now, this is a finding that comes over some years, that the ANC has increasingly moved in a direction that is at odds with the racial moderation that its core supporters wish to see. And we will get into that in a bit more detail. So those are the headline findings. The next question, of course, is methodology. And do pardon me if I perhaps pause at this for a while longer than might be strictly necessary. It is important for us to put our methodology up front, because after all, it is the methodology of a survey and an opinion poll that determines whether it should be trusted, taken seriously. And at the IRR, we are proud of the methodologies that we've applied over the years, ensuring credible findings. And it is perhaps worth pointing out that these surveys that we carry out annually are quite costly. So for us to have lacking methodological integrity would quite simply be a waste of money. It is not in our interest to have a dubious approach to our findings, and that is why going through the methodology we find it does assist in explaining why we have faith in our findings. Do pardon me, this has been happening a few times this morning. If I think my PowerPoint might be experiencing that end of year bug, but I will hopefully quickly resume to where we need to be. Firstly, our survey was taken between the 27th of March and the 3rd of April. As Makone mentioned in her introductory remarks, this was a significant moment, and initially my fear was that this survey would be polluted by the circumstances, in the sense that it was a highly unusual political climate in place when the survey was in the field, and yet the findings have proven quite useful and prescient, even if there are some qualifications in terms of our political findings at the time, and I would be happy to go into that in the Q&A session, but they are quite set out at length in the political report, the first of these 3 installments looking at the IRR's 2025 polling. Our sample size was 807, and this is perhaps the question on polling that I get most often. Why is such a small sample actually representative? How can we trust it? Now, as will be made clear, hopefully, in the next phases of the methodology discussion, a sample of 800 is statistically considered sufficient to make firm findings, of course, with a margin of error of 4% above and 4% below the actual finding in the number. So we have a 95% confidence level, and that is also in line with international best practice. We screened only registered voters. Now, the key of a representative poll goes along with the clarity of the questionnaire. So, of course, the questions themselves can't introduce a bias. You can't, for example, ask, given the ANC's track record on corruption and job creation, who would you vote for in an election? You can't say, given the momentum that MK experienced during the last election, who would you vote for in an election? Those introduce biases and contamination in your questionnaire. So we try to stick to the clearest and most direct meaning of questions. And that is why questionnaire design is step one, or step two, actually, in terms of making sure you have credible findings. The questions are grouped thematically so as to not confuse the survey respondents. Neutral language is used, and when necessary, follow-up questions are introduced. The data is then weighted according to multiple markers of the South African population by age, by gender, by province, urban versus rural residency, etc., to make sure that the sample we arrive at is actually a microcosm and a fair reflection of the population as a whole. We delve deeper into this to substantiate the claim of accuracy. And this is where I'm going to perhaps elaborate on the size of our sample. A sample is, of course, an important component of an opinion poll, but it is not the most important once a specific threshold has been reached. I can give you an example. If I go to an ANC rally and I have a sample of 10,000 people, and I ask them who they will vote for in an upcoming election, despite the size of the sample being impressive, the sample itself won't be representative because it won't align with the general makeup of the South African voting population. And the same, of course, goes for other considerations. If I go to a cultural festival in KwaZulu-Natal, I might get a distorted view because I might have a sample of thousands and yet not a representative sample. So once you clear the threshold of a credible sample, which lies roughly at about the 600 mark statistically, you need to ensure not only that you have a sensible sample size, but that your sample is actually representative. I again use the example of a pizza. It is not necessary to eat a very large part of a pizza to understand what it generally tastes like as a whole. You just need to make sure that the slice you take is representative of the whole, making sure that the feta, the olives, the cheese, the anchovies, if that appeals to you, is represented on your slice. In that sense, you can make sure that the slice is a significant and reliable indicator of the overall whole. Randomness is, of course, critical to this process. You can't pick a specific part of the pizza with a bias towards that particular part, because then you undermine the representativity. So that means all South Africans of voting age effectively need a similar chance of being contacted for the survey, on top of enough of them being contacted. For this, software is used that generates random South African cell phone numbers. These are called, and the process of generating these numbers are repeated until a sufficient sample size is arrived at with a complete survey set. As you can imagine, some people would complete a survey and others might not. So the effort in the logistical challenge is really to make sure that you phone enough of these random numbers in South Africa, not just to get a good sample size, but to make sure that your sample actually reflects the country as a whole. And this is where something like the geographic distribution comes in. In our survey of 807 respondents, 23.5 were from Gauteng, 19% from KwaZulu-Natal, 12.5% from the Eastern Cape, 12.1% from Limpopo, 10.7% from the Western Cape, 7.2% from the Free State, 7.1% from Mpumalanga, Northwest 6.5%, Northern Cape 1.5%. So you see, we try to ensure that we have a representative sample specifically on these markers that I'm going through now, geographic distribution being one of about 23. We then also look at residential distribution, and in our survey, 37.1% of respondents were inhabitants of tribal land, 30.3% were inhabitants of township areas, 18% of suburbs, and so forth, all the way down to 0.1% representing smallholding inhabitants. In terms of age, the breakdown is again as representative as we could feasibly achieve to ensure fair findings and accurate weighting. With language, a very important factor in the South African social framework, isiZulu speakers were 22% of respondents, isiXhosa speakers were 18.9%, Afrikaans speakers were 12.4%, Sesotho speakers 12.2%, English speakers 10.5%, and other languages collectively comprise 24% of our respondents. Income level, again, a critical component of our population structure. Income levels below 2,000 Rand per month were 13% of our respondents, between 2,000 and 8,000 Rand, 57.7%, 8 to 20,000 Rand per month, 10.1%, 20,000 Rand and above 13%, and those who opted not to disclose that information, 6.1%. So that is a bit of a taster to show the demographic representativity, the accuracy of our pizza slice, the various ingredients being present on it to justify the findings of this survey. Any further questions on the methodology, I'd be happy to take in the Q&A session. So moving on from methodology to analysis of our findings, we start with race relations and inequality. Here we find the question that I mentioned in our key findings, where we asked South Africans since 1994, have race relations between people of different races in South Africa improved, stayed the same, or become worse? 46 said improved, 36 said became worse, 18% said stayed the same, and 1% was undecided. This is an on the whole positive picture, yet it is notable that the 46% number is below a majority, and that is usually over the last few years not the case with our polling from the IRR. So there seems to be a dip in the number of South Africans who say that race relations have improved in the last 31 years, and yet that dip is within the context of other questions, but still something we cannot ignore. It is particularly useful to understand this question from a racial breakdown, and the graph on the screen currently shows to the left, improved, then stayed the same, then became worse, and to the right, undecided. You see the darkest blue bar represents the entire population, then the slightly lighter one, Black population, the slightly lighter one again, almost a dark turquoise, representing colored South Africans, the lighter turquoise, Indian South Africans, and the red, white South Africans. We are so close to December, so people could be excused for thinking that I chose the color red, because when this pale little skin of mine touches UV rays, that's roughly the hue I represent, but I can assure you that is simply randomized design of our slide templates. So if we then look at these categories, what immediately stands out is that white South Africans have by far the greatest perception of race relations improving since 1994. This is notable, especially considering that they have the lowest finding of worsened race relations since 1994. And it is significant for at least two reasons. Number one, pardon me, just another sip required, for at least two reasons. This goes some way to dispel the narrative that we have heard a lot, especially this year, of a large-scale victimization of white South Africans, perhaps especially Afrikaners. There is, of course, as we will see in subsequent data, the experience of racism, and there are some significant findings on that. But it is very important that the white South African perception of race relations since 1994 remains overwhelmingly positive. Were it a case of genocide or anything along those lines, it is highly unlikely that a finding like this could be arrived at in a credible survey. So this does dispel, to a certain credible extent, the idea of extensive white victimization on a mass scale. However, what is also important to note here is the historical context of South Africans, white South Africans, moving from a pariah to something of a constructive member of a new South Africa. Now, of course, the shine might have gone off the narrative of the Rainbow Nation, but it is clear that we see white South Africans appreciating the historical context of once having been the favored section of the South African society, and the disappearance of that status not being considered as a negative, in fact, considered as a positive to the extent that it affected race relations. What is notable here is the reality that we can't just look at one demarcator of findings, and here age is particularly useful. Here you will see the age groups identified with the youngest, 18 to 24 on the left of your screen, all the way to the right, the 65 and above, with the colors denoting in dark blue, improved race relations, gray stayed the same, the red became worse, and light turquoise, I'd say, undecided. The dark blue line is a significant reason for hope, I would say, specifically given that it is highest among the 25 to 35 age group. These are South Africans, like myself, just about, who experienced very little of apartheid and only have an experience of, as it were, the post-94 South Africa. And it should go some way to instill hope that this group with this exclusive experience has a very positive, or has the most positive view. The group with a second most positive view also fits into this post-94 category. So there does seem to be a very firm generational line that people born after 1994 without the baggage of apartheid do have, on the whole, a more positive perception. As South Africans are older in terms of this graph, you will see that the line dips from 50 to 47 to 40 to 38, and the three categories of 35 to 44, 45 to 64, and 65 and above contain the highest number of people who say that race relations have gotten worse since 1994. If you combine these factors, you also see the socioeconomic importance. Now, that graph is not included here just for readability of the report and for the slide, but I can say that households earning below 2,000%, of those only 30% say race relations have improved, compared to 41% of the 2,000 to 8,000 range, 54% of the 8,000 to 20,000 range, and 62% of the households with a monthly income above 20,000 Rand. It is incredibly telling that you see a very clear correlation between socioeconomic position and a perception of improved race relations, this link is vital to understanding that the experience of race and the perception of race relations in and of themselves are not what shape the question of race relations, but that there is a significant material socioeconomic component attached to this. We move on to gender differences, which are measurable yet small. 48% of men and 42% of women believe race relations have improved. Again, and this is some speculation, but again, there seems to be a socioeconomic current here with the reality that women are marginally more likely to say that race relations have worsened, likely reflecting the intersection of economic hardship, unemployment, and vulnerability to social instability and crisis. So it is not necessarily to say that women are more pessimistic about race relations. That is certainly what the sort of the prima facie reading of the data would indicate. But if one reads into the data supporting that, the reality that women in South Africa are more socioeconomically vulnerable, and we take into account the reality that income rises alongside a positive perception of race relations since 1994, it becomes clear that we cannot simply assume that race is what it says on the tin. In a very real society or societal case, socioeconomic factors, desperation, vulnerability contribute to the perception of race relations since 1994. It is further, as mentioned earlier, necessary not just to see race relations in a retrospective perception. We do also ask other questions on this, specifically because the question cannot have race relations improved, stay the same, or become worse, can't really appreciate all the factors of the reality of racism in South Africa. In a sense, that question asks a perceptional projection question rather than a personal conviction question. And you need to move from the perceptional to the personal to understand racial experiences. This is where this question on the screen currently gains its traction and usefulness. We asked survey respondents, indicate whether you agree or disagree with the following statement. The different races need each other for progress, and there should be full opportunity for people of all colors. An astonishing 73% agree with that statement and 25% disagree. Taken together, we do see that despite the experience of racism being perhaps more marginal, positive versus negative, the normative aspiration of people wanting the different races to have sound relations isn't a question at all within the data. In fact, it is clearly positioned. And again, we see an overlap across all race groups. Pardon me, I think there is a mistake in this slide. That is not the right slide, so I will move on. We then get to the next issue of racism as lived reality and political rhetoric. So we looked at racism in terms of inequality and the perception of it, but the next question really is racism being experienced. Here we ask the question, have you personally experienced racism, any form, pardon me, of racism in the last 5 years? Overall, we see a slight majority for no, 52 to 48, yet it is notable that that 52% is lower than historic standards of IRR polling in previous years. It is the lowest I have seen it. Usually it is around the 60% mark and above. So there is a question of some concern in this year's survey versus that of 2024, 23, 22, and beyond. Broken down by racial category, this is where this issue of who is experiencing racism becomes important. You will see that the two groups with the largest share of personal experience of racism in the last 5 years are white South Africans and Indian South Africans. So we see another myth here being dispelled in a sense. Similarly to the white victimhood narrative, we also see the dispelling of what one could consider the critical race theory myth, where there is a base assumption that Black people need to perceptually be and perpetually be, pardon me, the victims of systemic racism. By some margin, Black South Africans are the group here experiencing the least amount of reported racism on this question of personal racism in the last 5 years, where Indian South Africans, not traditionally part of the CRT hierarchy at a victimhood position below Black people, victimhood so-called, experiences or reports experiences of the most. So we see the lazy myth of white victimhood and the lazy myth of Black victimhood both being dispelled by the data in front of us. If we look beyond race and we consider status in the economy and employment position, what is very telling is that the questions relating to the formal economy, owns a business in the formal economy and working in the formal economy, the second and third categories on your screen from above, we see a disproportionate experience of racism. Add to that retired South Africans who are relatively recently socioeconomically positioned for engagement. It is telling that the formal economy represents, as it were, the position with the highest categories of racial experience. So we see whites and Indians being the categories reporting the highest rates of racial experience or racism experiences. We see the formal economy either owns a business or working in the formal economy or being retired, also matching that criteria of the highest intensity of racist experiences. And if we look at income by household, we see that the two categories of 8,000 to 20,000 Rand and 20,000 Rand and above, your typical middle class formal economy levels of income, they experience the most racism as well. If we combine these three factors, it becomes clear that the areas of the South African society where policies like BEE and employment equity are most strenuously applicable in the formal economy, to the detriment quite often of white and Indian South Africans, who represent a larger chunk of the middle class proportionately than colored and Black South Africans relative to each population group. It is clear that the presence in the formal economy of policies like BEE and employment equity agitate experiences of racism. This ought not to be a surprising finding, but it certainly might be a controversial one. Again, the context of racial experiences need further elaboration. Despite the experience of personal racism, we see 76% of South Africans, 3/4, reporting that talk of racism and colonialism by politicians are these politicians trying to find excuses for their own failures. What stands out from this is the across the board majorities that fall well beyond the margin of error in this poll. The 52% of South Africans who have not, pardon me, experienced racism in the last 5 years, and the 48 fall within the margin of error, so one could consider it a statistical tie of half and half. The weaponization of racism, despite it being experienced in the political sense, is widely rejected by 3/4 at least of almost all societal groups. 73% of blacks, 72% of coloreds, 100% of Indians, and 91% of whites. So despite the experience of racism being real, being perhaps even troubling, the reality that half of our country experiences racism in the last, or experienced racism in the last 5 years, personally, that is, of course, by no means a reason to celebrate. But if we contextualize it within the broader attitudinal space, we understand that those causes are most likely policy-based as they occur in the economy, in the demographic makeup of the society's most exposed segments to these policies. So what do we make of this dual reality that racism is experienced at the same time as that racism is considered to have broadly improved since 1994? Additionally, that 70+% of South Africans see a normative aspiration of all the races getting along with equal opportunity. What do we make of these conflicting narratives? We can't deny the fact that racism is still experienced, but it no longer structures South Africa's social or political order, as most people reject both racism and its political weaponization. We see that in the 70+ majority in favor of all the statement that all races need each other and that there should be equal opportunity, and in the broad categorization of political rhetoric on racism and colonialism being seen as a smokescreen by politicians to cover for their failures. So it is still experienced as a reality, but people aspire to a rejection of it in terms of both national aspirations and within the political contest of messaging. Policy-driven racialization creates friction where people work, study, and live together, even as most South Africans, perceive long-term improvement in race relations. The oft-repeated narratives of simplistic black or white victimhood have extremely limited explanatory power. And we phrase this deliberately because at the end of the day, what the data is supposed to do is make sense of what we see around us and experience. If we were to approach the South African reality on race relations purely from the perspective of white, black victimhood, the data wouldn't make sense. That is why we say it has limited explanatory power. It cannot explain the reality as is presented by the data. Policies that divide by race undermine ordinary social progress, while expanding merit-based opportunity will most likely strengthen cooperation and non-racialism. That we get from the finding, also in our survey, that 73% of South Africans agree with the statement that with better education and more jobs, inequality between the races will steadily disappear. If we take into context the finding that policies like BE and employment equity create racial friction there where they are most strenuously applied, and we contrast it to the aspiration that better education and more jobs will lead to racial equality, that is where we see this tension between the aspiration towards non-racialism, the considered path of socioeconomic upliftment rather than racial design, and we see the tension created by policy. So very much what we're looking at is a diagnostic of policy that finds race-based policies to be an impediment to sound race relations and progress. The next area of findings we look at is that national priorities are deracialized. Here we see them represented as a whole, all South Africans being grouped together, unemployment or creating jobs by far and away the most important priority. If we then look to the bottom of the priority list, we see inequality, including gender and racial inequality, racism, land reform. These, again, indicate that what drives South Africans in terms of their socioeconomic desperation is not a race-based approach, but frankly, the socioeconomic upliftment that we saw also as the perceptional cure to racial inequality in the previous questions. If we break this down by race, we see some variation. We see some exaggerated concerns here and there and some undersold. But in general, what is clear from this graph is the broad consensus that materializes across racial issues. Unemployment and creating jobs are the number one priority for all racial groups. That would, of course, make sense given the employment situation in South Africa. If we then move on to the interesting question of political parties, we see an echoing of the racial findings of a consensus that MK, EFF, the ANC, and the DA, the four largest parties in the country, really do see a population, or at least an electorate, with similar aspirations. That means there might be disagreement about how jobs ought to be created, how illegal immigration ought to be addressed, how crime and safety and security should be tackled with corruption, the abuse of women and children, etc. There might be questions of the how, but the population is clearly indicating that there are not questions of the what the national priorities are. Then we get to that question of whether socioeconomic upliftment would be the preferable route. And the majority is clear. 73% of South Africans find that with better education and more jobs, the present inequality between races will steadily disappear. It is worth noting that this finding has had a consistent majority at or above 70%. So it is not, I think, an aberrational find or a specific find. It is a find that is generally applicable and that reflects, I think, innate moderation when it comes to socioeconomic questions and the pragmatism of South Africans when they look at the country and the problems we face. Broken down by racial groupings, we see again that the majorities cut across all racial groups. The idea of socioeconomic advancement as the basis of a healthier racial equality environment isn't devoted or the unique product of one group or another. It really is across the board representative of a sound, moderate, pragmatic majority. We then get to the question of if socioeconomic aspiration is the route to the eradication of a time of racial inequality, the means by which that ought to be achieved surely should be job creation, if we read that together with the national priorities. And here we asked South Africans the question, who should be appointed to jobs in South Africa? We gave them four options. Pardon me. Firstly, only Black people should be appointed to jobs for a very long time ahead. Secondly, only Black people should be appointed until those in employment are demographically representative of the entire population. This is a very important question as it represents a direct reflection of current employment equity policies as issued and enforced by the Department of Labor and Employment. Thirdly, appointment should be made on the basis of merit, but there should be special training to help previously disadvantaged groups. Note that that isn't there should be special treatment, but special training. The undercurrent of merit is very strongly present in that response, with the added socioeconomic upliftment component of getting disadvantaged South Africans to be able to compete on merit. So we shouldn't confuse training with treatment in this specific phrasing. And then fourth, all appointments should be on the basis of merit alone without any special training being available. A very pure position. In terms of only Black people being appointed for a very long time ahead, that gained the support of 9% of South Africans and 12% of Black South Africans. In terms of the clear employment equity position of demographic representativity that received the lowest support of all the options, with only 6% in total and 8% of Black South Africans supporting essentially the current government policy approach. By far the most popular option was option number 3. Appointment should be made on the basis of merit, but there should be special training to help people from previously disadvantaged groups. And then the second largest group finding was the merit-only approach. It is therefore fair to conclude from this that there is a firm rejection of race-based policy without there being a denial of the legacy of past race-based policies. I don't think anyone can get away from the reality that apartheid was about racial preferencing. But what the data indicates is that that racial preferencing is no longer considered venal or abhorrent or undesirable because of its racism, but because of its socioeconomic consequences. The real harm and hurt of apartheid remaining with us today is not racial, but access to socioeconomic upliftment. Hence, a policy based on a combination of merit and skills development is the preferred route for appointments in South Africa by an astonishing combined majority of 85%. It is notable that across the race groups, the national picture is reflected. Black South Africans especially, who one would expect would be the most obvious supporters of the race-based pro-Black appointment policies, whilst supporting them to a greater extent than other race groups, reject them in comparison to other merit-based alternatives. The other component of BEE, beyond hiring and beyond the impact of economic employment equity transformation, is, of course, public procurement. Here, historically, the idea of purchasing by the government being made on race basis rather than merit or value for money has been a core part of BEE and has been a radically vocal part of its defense this year. The problem is that it is out of sync with the South African appetite. The question we put to South Africans was as follows. The government spends over R1 trillion per year buying goods and services. How should it decide who to buy from? Option number 1, the government should buy on a value for money basis, making sure to buy the best product from any company at the best price without overpaying. Second option, the government should buy more from Black-owned companies, even if it means paying more and getting less value for the same money. To a very real and practical extent, this is what BEE has meant in terms of systemic markups leading to a fiscal cost likely of R100 billion a year and above to the taxpayer. The third option, the government should buy on a value for money basis, making sure to buy the best product at the best price. If two companies are tied, the Black-owned company should get the contract. Again, the competition isn't close. South Africans appreciate the role of the government in procurement is service delivery, not race rigging. The idea that service delivery should be a political pawn for the government to push racial transformation is clearly rejected. Between these two questions of appointment and procurement, we see a wholesale rejection of the basis of BEE policies, of race-based policies, as though to drive the point home of what preference should be given to merit versus racial transformation. We ask the question of sporting quotas in national teams, and as you can see on the screen, an astonishing majority approving of a merit-based system rather than racial quotas. Finally, we get to the question of party politics. This will be quite brief. What was most telling about this finding is the shift in Black voters over the last year. In October 2024, the IRR polled Black voters on who they would support in an election. The ANC was above 50%, MK 15%, the DA roughly 5%. Given the socio-economic context of the VAT debate and subsequent settled polling floors and ceilings, there has now been a shift where the DA seems to have consistently and reliably at least tripled or possibly quadrupled its support from Black South Africans. If we look at more recent opinion polling finding that the ANC is on 37% nationally and the DA on 32% nationally, that likely means a stabilization of this change brought about by the VAT debate. In the end, it seems what broke through the glass ceiling for the DA seeking the support of Black voters was not some form of race-based policy, but a question of economic bread and butter issues. That leads us to our conclusions. Race relations show cautious optimism, with just short of majority, 46% approving of the state of race relations since 94. Economic experience drives perception. The higher the income bracket, the higher the perception of improved race relations. Policy, not people, drive racial friction. To the extent that South Africans interact on a horizontal basis, we see an aspiration for collaboration. The moment we introduce areas of policy, of income, of race, and employment status, we see an increase in the consequences of BEE and employment equity as drivers of racial friction. South Africans overwhelmingly endorse non-racial cooperation. National priorities are deracialized. Merit-based fairness is a national consensus. Political identities are shifting. And this final point is perhaps the key point of the entire presentation today. South Africa is now a country with a deracialized electorate. However, we have a racialized political class. Voters define fairness through competence and opportunity, not through race. And yet we see parties clinging to racial rhetoric. This is an enormous electoral risk given the new state of race relations in terms of political party support. I thank you for your time this morning. I do apologize for going a bit long. I hope you appreciate that the findings themselves needed to be the star of the show. And Makone, if it is okay with you, I'm more than willing to add 10, 15 minutes to our time, should that become necessary.
Thank you so much, Hermann. We have just about over 100 people joining us across all platforms. Thank you and welcome again to you all. I hope you found Hermann's presentation as encouraging as I did, as fascinating as I did. I thought, the future of race relations in South Africa is somewhat very heartening. And yes, we will add that 10 minutes extra Q&A, but I see we only have 2 questions, both from Armin Miller. So let me put them to Hermann. The first one speaks to a topic that you delved on and paid great emphasis to in the beginning, which is a methodological one, right? And he's asking, seeing as this is a race relations survey, what was the respondent spread in terms of race? And then he asks again, how have the survey outcomes changed over the last 30 years? That's quite a mammoth of a task to answer, but I'm sure you can give a summary.
Yes, so let me just open the relevant data here so that I make sure I answer accurately. So in terms of the racial breakdown of the population, 77.2% of respondents were Black, 8.8% of respondents were colored, 2.9% were Indian, and 11.1% were white. and that broadly reflects the voting age population of South Africa. How have these things changed over 30 years? Surprisingly little. This is the first time I see less than a majority of South Africans reporting a perception of improved race relations since 1994. It is the lowest I have ever seen the no answer in terms of have you personally experienced racism in the last 5 years. It's just 1 year's finding, so it's not possible to say if this is a definitely declining trend. We'll see in 2026 and 2027. But those, I would say, are the main changes, that the picture of race relations, while still good, isn't as overwhelmingly optimistic as perhaps it was a year or two ago, but one would expect these sorts of changes to occur. But it is, as I say, far too early to indicate whether this is a declining trend. However, the questions of aspiration rather than experience, do the races need each other? Those questions remain firmly majoritized and reliable, and therefore I think reasons for hope.
All right, I'll put one question to you whilst we wait for any more. We do have just comments of gratitude from Mario Hockley and Klaus Gatter. Thank you both. Let me ask you, Hermann, about the incentives that political parties have, if you perceive any, to align themselves with the views and the demands of their voters, because you've implied it now to some extent with detailing the demographic makeup, racial demographic breakdown of the respondents of the survey, who overwhelmingly reject racialization and the emphasis of race in policy, and specifically policy that purports to want to achieve redress. What incentives do you perceive, if any, for political parties to change tune and better align themselves and walk more in lockstep with those views of the voters?
I would answer with reference to 2 points. Number one is the VAT debate. That in all the polling surveys that I've studied, that was possibly the biggest single shift or causal cause of political support shifts, especially when considered through a racial lens, looking at just Black voters in this instance. The fact that the DA went from 5% support to 15, 18, possibly now 19% of support from Black voters is significant. And the fact that it is so intensely connected to the VAT debate is of significant consequence. In that finding at the time of the VAT debate, we saw 4 parties notably increase their support from October, September the previous year. So it was just 4 or 5 months. Those parties were the DA, the MK, the EFF, and Action SA. Those were the 4 parties with the strongest anti-VAT hike message. Now, you can debate the merit of each of their positions, but what the public clearly saw were parties aggressively against a VAT increase, and then some parties, predominantly the ANC, the Patriotic Alliance, and the IFP, in favor of a VAT increase. And the corresponding shifts matched perfectly. The parties that opposed the VAT increase saw their support rise, the parties that supported the VAT increase saw their support dip. So the first takeaway from that is that socioeconomic issues are quite clearly the territory where significant moves of support can be achieved. So I would say, what should parties take away from this? Well, firstly, the reality that racial pandering no longer works. It might have worked, and there's some evidence to think that it worked in the early elections, like the 1999 election. In particularly, the ANC weaponized it quite effectively against the then quite infant threat of the UDM in the Eastern Cape. But the fact that the greatest shift in the underlying racial makeup of the support systems of the parties being linked to a non-racial issue, a very clear socioeconomic bread and butter issue that affects all races and all classes equally, that being VAT, would be an indication that if parties were to seek to broaden their appeal, pandering isn't the way to go. South Africans, I always say that the South African electorate might not be terribly sophisticated, but they're not stupid. They understand the sufferings they're going through, and they understand when someone is lying to them. And I think a very good example of this would have been the DA in 2019, when they were campaigning suddenly on the issue of illegal immigration. The party hadn't had the necessary credibility on the issue for a significant amount of time, and broadly it didn't work. It was a rejected sort of political play, considered pandering, and I think that is the risk to all parties. Speak to the substance, because the people of South Africa understand the substance perhaps better than we expect. The second point I would say is that over the period of the ANC's most aggressive doubling down of their race-based policies, they have suffered not only a dip in support, but also electoral turnout has dipped. If South African voters look towards the political landscape and they see too much race-based policies coming from all parties, it is no stretch of the imagination to understand that that might be a contributing factor to just overall disengagement from democratic politics. So it is almost sort of the sunk cost fallacy for South African politics. We've invested 100 years in racial politics. We can't now let it go. But I think the advice from the data would be clearly that when political debate centered on a clear socioeconomic issue, the numbers changed dramatically. And two, when politics was at its most non-racial, i.e. 1994 to 2004, democratic turnout was at its most potent. Now, I'm not saying that that is a sole causal link and that nothing else matters. It is just clear that from the data, it would be a responsible deduction to make that substance of material change, hartsak politiek, stuff that affect the cost of living on a daily basis like that, offers the most substantive route to political engagement.
Let me take the last two questions for today. The first is from Mario Hockley, who asks, how do we change these issues? Is it only at the voting poll? And the last one will be from Henny Schultz, who asks if it would be possible to collaborate with Stats SA, re-racial related polling and statistics, or alternatively, find a way for our government to consider and possibly recognize the results from polling data. I fear when I hear government involvement with polling data after Action SA's latest proposal, but you take it away there, Hermann.
So how do we change these issues? Is it only at the voting poll? Mario's question. You know, that is the holy grail for opinion research, it's especially in the political sphere. What we shouldn't overclaim with the data is that we've got a perfect understanding of what will motivate a voter on voting day. That is actually a very complex question. If you look at the research for why people who were registered to vote did not vote, quite often the answer would be logistical difficulties. They couldn't get off work or whatever. They couldn't get to the polling station. They didn't have transport. They couldn't find their ID. So why people vote on the day is actually a very, very complex question. So I wouldn't be as bold as to pretend that our data contains perfect answers to that. What I would say is that this is where a combination of civic pressure and political pressure would likely be the most profitable route. When in mid-2023, the IRR decided that we are going to make economic growth a central feature of political debate. What we then saw over the next year or so was an increase of coverage on social media and in news media of 177%. So the IRR's decision, with our limited resources, yet with our legacy and our reach, managed to identify the issue of economic growth and propel it from being a relatively mundane topic of politics to, when the GNU was formed, becoming the number one priority. It's interesting, if one reads the ANC's manifesto, the concept of economic growth appears once. And yet, by the time of the GNU statement of intent is signed, it is the number one priority, inclusive economic growth. So from that, I think we can learn that opinion formation by entities like the IRR can have real consequence in dragging the debate to where South Africans want it to be. So my first point of response would be support those entities that have a track record of moving the debate to where it needs to be. My second point would be that as a society, we can no longer afford the outsourcing of politics to the politicians, in the sense that when a manifesto from a party comes out, it shouldn't be the first time we engage a party with their policies. The pressure on us, on parties from the ANC, MK, EFF, DA, whatever, the pressure on these parties to adopt certain issues or principles or stances should well predate manifestos. And in that sense, the era of WhatsApp, of social media, is a golden era for civilian influence on policy formation. Despite my suspicion and detestation of their methods, one can look at something like Operation Dudula, that have successfully become not quite a political party, but a bridge between genuine civic interest in an issue and ensuring it carries political weight. The opportunity to change these issues, to move the debate to where we want it to be, I think we can do a lot worse than studying Operation Dudula's approach, perhaps not copying their tactics, but understanding what it is that makes an issue go from peripheral to central. So support, I think, entities like the IRR who have managed to move the debate close to where it needs to be, and also appreciate that civic pressure on politics, not just on public discourse, but on politics and political parties directly, can deliver the necessary results. And I think South African history is a testament to that. Then on Henny's question, the thing is, I'm going to answer it in two steps. Number one, the ANC, the EFF, MK, and the DA are actually quite aware of opinion polling from, amongst others, the IRR. I know for a fact that these get discussed, definitely at NEC meetings. So it's not that the ANC and the government and the parties of government are ignorant of these findings. I think in the case of the ANC, it's much more an institutional paralysis that prevents them from responding to these issues in an effective political way. Take again the VAT example. The public opinion against a VAT increase, the momentum of that was so enormous. And yet, even given the enormity of that momentum and the unpopularity of that decision, the ANC was saved from its own position by a high court, not by its own political dynamism or understanding, let's change course. Changing course in politics is often the route to survival. The fact that the ANC could understand the data, could appreciate that they were taking an unpopular decision, but that they couldn't bring themselves to alter that decision on their own accord and needed to be saved by the judiciary, is, I think, an indication that it isn't ignorance that is keeping these sorts of findings to form a new political consensus. It is quite often just political paralysis, the ANC not knowing in which direction to travel. The second component of my answer would be, it is more important, to my mind, as the author of these reports, that the public have them in their heads than the politicians. Because at the end of the day, the first chamber and the biggest chamber of any parliament is your voting public. If we can convince the public that economic growth, non-racialism, help to those who need it, not to those of a specific skin color, if we can convince the public of that being such an acceptable and societally accepted point as wearing pants or trousers or driving on the left side of the road, then politics becomes a rule-taking entity, not a rule-making entity. So my answer to Henny would be, they are aware of the data. I don't think it's unawareness that's the problem for them to respond to this, but it is more important that we go upstream from politics. And that is where someone like Mario like Henny, like Peter, the people I'm seeing in the chat. That's why I appreciate their presence here today so deeply, because that is the first sort of pebble dropping that might cause an avalanche or a landslide.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Hermann, for putting together these reports and for making such great sense of them for all of us. Thank you also to the audience for joining us. We hope that you found this to be insightful and encouraging about the future of race and race relations in South Africa. Once again, we left a comment in the comment section of where you can find the reports. We've linked them there in the comments and you can find them there. And that will be all for us. Thanks again for joining, and goodbye.